Hello students, welcome to academia. Today we discuss about cell membrane. In our last discussion, we have gone through the structure of animal cells. There we found that a cell contains basic three structures, that are cell membrane, cytoplasm and its organelles, and nucleus and chromosome. So these are the three basic structures which we already have discussed, and also we have discussed about the difference between eukaryotic cell and prokaryotic cell. Now we move to the cell membrane structure. So the cell membrane, which is also known as plasma membrane, it is a very thin, elastic kind of structure which is composed entirely of proteins and lipids. Only 7.5 to 10 nanometer thickness of a cell membrane have. Approximately the composition of proteins in the cell membrane are 55%. The lipids include phospholipids, which are of 25%, cholesterol 13%, other lipids is of 4%. And another compound is carbohydrate, which are of 3%. So the three basic components are protein, then the lipids and the carbohydrates. So these are the approximate composition of the presence of proteins, lipids, carbohydrates in the cell membrane. So this is the structure of the cell membrane, and if we consider a small portion of the membrane and we magnify it, we can find under microscope, under electron microscope, that there are presence of the structure. These molecular structure are basically made up of lipids and proteins. So here we found that there is a lipid bilayer. These are the lipid bilayer, and in between the lipid bilayers there are different types of proteins. This is one protein, this is another protein, this is another protein, and these are the other proteins also attached with the membrane. These proteins are known as peripheral protein, whereas these are called integral or transmembrane proteins. So these are the peripheral proteins the lower one are the peripheral proteins. This is also peripheral protein. These are also some peripheral proteins which are present either at the facing the ECF or facing the ICF. So ICF, that is the cytoplasm. So this is the actual view. And what about the other structures, like these are the carbohydrate molecules. Which are also attached. These are the carbohydrates. The carbohydrates which are also attached with the proteins. So the carbohydrates, proteins and fats or lipids which constitute the structure of the plasma membrane, and where we found the lipid bilayer, that is the double layer of the lipid present, and one end of the lipid is adjacent with ECF, other is adjacent with the ICF, and the proteins are of the proteins which invade the membrane, and the proteins which are present like the transmembrane which invade the lipid bilayer and having the extracellular part as well as intracellular part are called the transmembrane or integral proteins, whereas the proteins which are present totally at the ICF portion or in the ECF portion, they are called peripheral proteins. The carbohydrate molecules are attached with the membrane proteins or membrane lipids, and all of these constitute the whole of the plasma membrane or cell membrane. So the basic trilaminar structure of all cell membrane is generally described as unit membrane. So we call it unit membrane. Now we go to the basic structures of these of the unit membrane, and which is comprises of lipid bilayer, protein and carbohydrate. Now, in the basic lipid bilayer, what type of lipid molecules we found? Actually, it is composed of phospholipid, basically. And the one end of the phospholipid molecule is hydrophilic. And the other end is hydrophobic. So the basic structure of the lipid molecule, if it is composed of phospholipid, then one end of the phospholipid molecule is hydrophilic, another end is hydrophobic. Now what do you mean by hydrophilic and hydrophobic ends? Okay, so the main lipids of cell membrane are phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethanolamine, aminophospholipid, sphingomyelin, phosphatidylglycerol, phosphatidylinositol. So these are the major lipids which are present in the cell membrane. And among these lipids, mainly in the outer layer of the lipid, we know that there are bilayer, lipid bilayer is present, as we have seen in the diagram. So the lipid which is present in the outer layer are mainly the phosphatidylcholine. So this kind of lipids are present in the outer lipid layer, as well as the ethanolamine, which is present in the inner layer. So this one is present in the outer layer of the lipid bilayer, and so is the inner molecule. These lipids are also distributed accordingly in the lipid bilayer. So generally the phospholipids are amphipathic in nature. Now what do you mean by the amphipathic nature of the phospholipids? If we consider that this is a lipid molecule, because the lipid is made up of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So if it is a lipid molecule, it is the hypothetical model because this head portion is also made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen as well as the tail portion. So if we consider the molecule as this, so the head portion is hydrophilic, that is which attract water. So the head of the lipid molecule is hydrophilic in nature. So here we have the hydrophilic head, hydrophilic portion. So this portion is also hydrophilic, but the tails are of hydrophobic. Okay, so the hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails constitute the one lipid molecule. So this portion is a small part of the membrane. If we enlarge it, we can find out the lipid bilayer, and this lipid bilayer, this one is the lipid bilayer. The lipid bilayer, the core of the bilayer is formed by hydrophobic tails, whereas the head portions which are attached with the cytoplasm, this area is the ICF is the intracellular fluid and the ECF is the extracellular fluid. So the heads are adjacent with the ECF and ICF, that is as they have the hydrophilic nature, whereas the tails are of hydrophobic and they form the core of the lipid bilayer. We can say that the hydrophilic heads remain in the outer and inner surfaces facing to ECF and ICF, and hydrophobic tails directed towards interior of the membrane. Okay, this portion. So this is about the lipid molecule, the variety of lipid molecules which constitute the cell membrane. They have this kind of bilayer structure, but the arrangement should not be like this. This is the correct arrangement, where this arrangement is not correct. In this manner, the molecules are present in the cell membrane. Now another important portion of the cell membrane are proteins. So after lipid having the major quantity or amount in the cell membrane structure, then comes the proteins. So The membrane proteins are actually the globular masses which are floating in the lipid bilayer, and most of them are glycoproteins. So if we classify, then there are two basic classification. Number one is the integral protein, or we can also call them transmembrane protein, and number two is the peripheral protein. So these two major category of proteins are we found in the cell membrane: integral protein or transmembrane protein and peripheral protein. Integral proteins are those proteins which pass through entire thickness of the membrane. If we consider that this is the part of a membrane, this is the enlarged view of the part of a membrane. So these kind of proteins which pass through the membrane lipid bilayer, and they have one extracellular part, that one, and having the intracellular part. So these kind of proteins which pass through the membrane and having the both intracellular and extracellular parts are called integral or transmembrane proteins. So they pass through the whole of the membrane and form the lipid bilayer or form the cell membrane. Another one is the peripheral protein, which may bind with the integral protein, or they may be bounded with the lipid membrane, but they are present at one end, either outside or inside. So next we see the peripheral proteins. Peripheral proteins are partially embedded in the outer and inner surfaces, and they do not penetrate. So here we see that this one is a peripheral protein, this one is a peripheral protein, this one is the peripheral protein, this one is also the peripheral protein. So these proteins are actually binded with the, they may be bounded with the integral protein, or they may be bounded with the lipid membrane, but they are present at outside or inside of the membranes. They do not penetrate the membrane. Okay. Various functions are served by these kind of proteins, whether integral or peripheral. For example, number one, like ion channels, number two, carriers, then number three, act as pumps, receptor, enzymes, adhesion molecule, then markers, etc. Basically, integral proteins act as carrier proteins, and also they act as receptor proteins, they act as the channels. As integral proteins are present in the whole of the lipid bilayer, and they also make connection with the ECF and ICF, so they may act as ion channels. So the proteins act as ion channels through which some substances which are not soluble in lipid can pass through inside the membrane, and sometimes they act as a carrier. They can carry some substances and also bring it inside the membrane. They act as pumps, they act as receptors. And as well as the peripheral proteins, they also have doing some of the activities of the cell membrane. So proteins, generally we know that proteins are versatile molecules, Versatile means those substances have lot of functions or multi-tasks. So they carry out this task. They can be the ion channels, they can be the pumps, they can be enzymes, they can be carriers, receptors, adhesion molecules, they can be the markers also. So the transmembrane as well as the peripheral proteins, they are very vital for the cell membrane functioning. The next most important part is carbohydrate. So this is the third major element for the lipid for the cell membrane, and the glycoportions of the molecules are basically the carbohydrates, and the glycoproteins, glycolipids. So these glycoportions which constitute the entire outside of the membrane and the surface of the cell, and these are called actually the loose carbohydrate covering, and there is a special name which is called glycocalyx. So the entire outside of the cell has a loose carbohydrate coating, and the carbohydrates are often attached with the lipids, and they often attach with the proteins, and they form this kind of coats which we called glycocalyx. So glycocalyx means the entire outside surface coating of the carbohydrate molecules, and they may attach with the proteins, they may attach with the lipids. The carbohydrates have negative electrical charges. The glycocalyx of some cells attach to the glycocalyx of other cells, thus they attach the cells together. One cell can be attached with another cell by the help of this kind of connection of the glycocalyx. Many of the carbohydrates act as the receptor substance also. So the carbohydrates also have some important roles in the membrane. So if we now say about the roles or the functions of cell membrane, then the proteins, lipids and the carbohydrates, all of them having important roles regarding the functioning of the cell membrane. And these protein, lipid and carbohydrate, all of these have important role in the cell membrane functioning. Generally, cell membrane is responsible for the transport function, transport from ECF to ICF, ICF to ECF, then phagocytic activities and a lot of other activities which we will also be discussed. So that was the fluid mosaic model which was discussed and proposed by Singer and Nicholson in 1972. So that fluid mosaic model we have discussed, and apart from this there are also unit membrane model and Danieli-Davidson model in 1957 as well as 1935. But among all these other scientists also proposed other models, but among all these things, all these models, the fluid mosaic model is much more established, and the cell membrane is basically made up of lipid bilayer, and we can say it is a lipid ocean where the proteins act as icebergs. So in fluid mosaic model, this is actually shown that in the lipid ocean the fluid proteins are floated like the icebergs. And as in the mosaic, when we have done the mosaic, there are different kind of and different sizes, different colored stone particles which are embedded in the cementing substance. Likewise, the lipid here act as the cementing substance, where the proteins are act as the stones, and these models, as it is the model of our body, of our cell, and it has the fluidity, it has the fluidic nature. So this fluid mosaic model is much more established, and this is the cell membrane model of which we have discussed. So the fluid mosaic model which is proposed by S. J. Singer and G. L. Nicholson, so the scientists. So this is in brief the discussion about the cell membrane model and the variety of parts of membrane, lipid, proteins and carbohydrates. Hope all of you can understand. Just go through these contents and try to understand the basic concepts, so that the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane will be clear to all of you.